I never imagined a weekend getaway would turn into something I couldn't shake from my mind, something that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew. It all started when I decided to escape the city and spend a few days alone at a cabin deep in the forest. I needed the silence, the kind of quiet you can only find miles away from traffic, notifications, and people. I wanted to feel the weight of nature pressing in around me, to breathe without interruption. But what I found there, hidden in the shadows of that wooden cabin, was something I wasn't prepared for. Something that would give me chills the moment I saw it. The forest was dense, a mix of towering pines and twisted oaks, the kind that makes the sunlight fight its way through just to touch the forest floor. The path to the cabin was narrow, overgrown, and felt like it hadn't been traveled in years. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as the car bounced over rocks and roots, the sound of branches scraping the sides of the vehicle making my heart race. There was a strange energy in the air, something that felt alive, watching, almost breathing along with me. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked and took a long, shaky breath, hoping that what awaited inside would be nothing more than creaking wood and the smell of old pine. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and exactly what I had pictured in my mind. It had that classic charm, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a porch that overlooked the dense forest. From the outside it seemed perfectly peaceful. But as soon as I stepped inside, I noticed that quiet tension that sometimes fills empty spaces. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something else I couldn't identify. The windows were dusty and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I told myself it was just an old cabin settling, nothing more. I spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring. The forest outside seemed alive, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig catching my attention. I wanted to take it all in, to breathe deeply and feel like I belonged there for a few days. But as the sun started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, I felt a strange pull toward a corner of the room I hadn't really paid attention to yet. That's when I saw it, a small leather-bound journal tucked behind an old armchair. Its cover was worn, and the edges of the pages were yellowed with age, like it had been waiting for someone to find it for decades. I hesitated before picking it up, a strange sense of dread mixing with curiosity. Why would someone leave a journal here in the middle of nowhere? I flipped it open and the first thing I noticed was the handwriting. It was messy, uneven, almost frantic at times. Whoever had written these entries had poured their thoughts onto these pages with a kind of urgency that made my stomach twist. The first line I read made me freeze. If anyone finds this, know that I didn't leave this place by choice. My pulse quickened as I skimmed through the early entries. They seemed ordinary at first, descriptions of the forest, the cabin, the writer's daily routines, but the tone changed quickly. There were mentions of strange sounds at night, shadows moving beyond the trees, and a feeling of being watched. I tried to dismiss it as the imagination of someone who had spent too much time alone, but the words were too specific, too vivid. One entry in particular stopped me cold. I hear them whispering my name. I don't know who they are, but they're here, always here. I can't sleep anymore. I set the journal down for a moment and tried to convince myself it was just a story, just someone's private thoughts. But there was something in the way the sentences twisted around each other, something in the repeated warnings, that made it hard to shake off the feeling that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. The forest outside seemed quieter suddenly, as if it too was holding its breath. Night fell faster than I expected. The shadows in the cabin deepened, and the familiar creaks of the old wood started to sound louder, almost deliberate. I lit a small lamp and sat back down with the journal, hoping to understand more, to maybe put my mind at ease. But every page I turned made me feel more unsettled. The entries grew darker, more desperate. The writer described being unable to leave the cabin even when they tried, and the feeling that something was lurking just outside the windows, waiting. I laughed nervously to myself, telling myself that it was probably the wind or an animal, but even as I said it, my eyes kept darting to the corners of the room, expecting to see movement. Then I found a page that made my skin crawl. It wasn't filled with words like the others. Instead, there was a rough sketch of the cabin with tiny figures surrounding it, shapes that didn't make sense, watching from the trees. In the margin, in the same frantic handwriting, someone had written, "They are closer than you think. Don't trust the forest." My heart was hammering. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up, a cold shiver running down my spine. I told myself again it was just imagination, just some creepy person's journal from years ago. But even as I tried to reason with myself, a branch snapped loudly outside, close enough that it made me jump. That I spent the rest of the evening half reading, half listening to the forest. Every little sound made me tense, every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the person who wrote it, and about what might still be out there, hidden behind the trees, watching, waiting. There was a pull, a need to keep reading, to understand, even though part of me wanted to throw the journal away, lock it in a drawer, and never look back. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and fear often makes it stronger. I finally decided to get some sleep, telling myself I needed rest to think clearly in the morning. I placed the journal on the nightstand, the lamp casting a small circle of light across the pages. But as I lay in bed, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the cabin. Something was out there. Something that didn't belong. I kept thinking about the words, "Don't trust the forest." And even as I tried to calm myself, I realized that the forest wasn't just trees and animals, it was something else entirely. Something alive. Something that knew I was here. By the time sleep finally took me, it wasn't a restful, peaceful sleep. My dreams were filled with shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers I couldn't understand, and a sense of being followed, even in my own mind. And when I woke up, the journal was still there, waiting, as if it had a story that needed to be finished. I don't know what I expected when I decided to stay at a cabin deep in the forest, but I never imagined finding a journal that would leave me questioning reality. I don't know who wrote it or why or what exactly they are. All I know is that something in those pages has already changed the way I see this place, this forest, and even myself. And I have a feeling that what I read next is going to make me understand that whatever is out there isn't just part of a story, it's real and it's closer than I want it to be. Morning arrived slowly, the sun barely breaking through the dense canopy of the forest. I woke with a start, the journal still on the nightstand beside me, its pages whispering secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. The air inside the cabin felt heavier than before, as if the night had left something behind. I rubbed my eyes and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but the memory of the previous night's whispers and shadows lingered like a cold fog. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the forest. The trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, but there was something different about the way the light hit them, the way the shadows seemed to move just a little too much, almost like they were alive. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking, that it was just the isolation messing with my mind. But I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the person who had written it, and about the repeated warnings to not trust the forest. As I leafed through the pages again, I started noticing patterns in the entries. The writer had stayed in the cabin for weeks, maybe even months, though it wasn't clear exactly how long. They wrote about the forest as if it had moods, sometimes gentle and calm, sometimes dark and threatening. They described hearing voices, footsteps that didn't belong to any animal, and shadows that didn't match any shape of the trees. And there were hints of something worse, something that had driven them to fear even the simplest things, like the wind or the sound of a branch breaking. One entry stood out more than the others. It was dated several months after the writer first arrived, and it was almost frantic, the handwriting messy as if they had been shaking while writing. "I don't know how long I can keep this up," it read. "They are patient. They wait for me. I thought I was clever, hiding, avoiding, but the forest knows. I can feel them around the cabin at all times. I don't know what they are, but they're not human, and I'm not sure I want to find out." I shivered as I read it. Whoever had written this had been terrified, living in constant fear. And yet they had stayed, had chronicled everything, and left this journal for someone like me, to find. I felt a pull toward the forest, a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Part of me wanted to step outside, to see if the air and sunlight could shake the tension in the cabin. But another part of me hesitated, remembering the sketches in the journal, figures hidden among the trees watching. I wanted to believe it was imagination, but a small voice inside my head whispered that the forest might be more than it seemed. As the day went on, I explored more of the cabin, looking for any other clues. Behind a stack of firewood in the corner, I found a small box filled with photographs. They were black and white, old, some faded nearly to nothing. Most were of the forest, the cabin, and a figure that appeared in the background of almost every picture. It was impossible to tell much about the figure, blurred, shadowed, but there was a sense of movement, almost as if the person had been caught mid-step or had been hiding. My stomach twisted as I realized the photos were likely taken by the same person who wrote the journal. They had been watching, documenting, and maybe even fearing someone, or something else was watching back. I sat down on the floor, staring at the photographs, and tried to piece together the story. The more I looked, the more I felt like I was following someone else's footsteps, someone who had lived in the same space, breathed the same air, and faced the same fears. The journal was more than a collection of thoughts. It was a warning, a map of experiences that I wasn't sure I was ready to follow. But the questions gnawed at me. Who had written it? Why did they leave it here? And most importantly, What had they meant by the forest not being trustworthy? Hours passed, and the sun began to dip behind the trees again. I had tried to distract myself, cooking a simple meal, tidying the cabin, even stepping out onto the porch to breathe, but the forest seemed to hum with quiet energy, a constant presence that I couldn't shake. I kept catching glimpses of movement just at the edge of my vision. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, and every bird call or rustle of leaves sounded amplified, like it carried a message I couldn't understand. As evening approached, I found myself returning to the journal again. This time, I read the entries more carefully, noticing subtle details I hadn't before. The writer described footsteps that circled the cabin at night, small marks in the dirt around the porch, and even strange patterns in the trees, like symbols carved not by human hands. They wrote about dreams that blended into reality, making it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Reading it, I could feel their fear, almost as if it were seeping through the pages and into me. By the time night fell, I was exhausted but couldn't sleep. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see something there, something I couldn't yet name. I tried to rationalize, telling myself the wind, the animals, the isolation. It all made sense. But then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, like whispering carried on the wind. It was so quiet I wasn't sure I had imagined it. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The whispering didn't form words, at least not any I could understand, but it carried an unmistakable sense of intent, like it was directed at me. I turned back to the journal, hoping for answers, but instead I found more questions. The later entries became even more disturbing. The writer mentioned leaving strange offerings outside the cabin, marking the trees and speaking to the forest in ways that didn't make sense to anyone else. "I do what I must to stay safe," one line read. Another said, "They are patient and they remember. The forest is alive in ways you cannot imagine." I could feel the tension in my chest tighten. The journal wasn't just a record of fear, it was evidence of something alive in the forest, something that could see, wait, and maybe even manipulate. I forced myself to take a break, stepping outside into the cool night air. The forest was dark, dense, and almost suffocating. The sounds were louder now, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch somewhere deep in the trees, the distant howl of an animal, but beneath it all, there was a rhythm I couldn't place. It was deliberate, like the forest itself was breathing, moving with intention. I shivered and returned to the cabin, locking the door, though the sense of being watched didn't leave me. Sitting back down with the journal, I realized that I was no longer just reading a story. I was part of it now. Every warning, every frantic scribble, every shadowy sketch felt directed at me, like the writer had left a trail for someone to follow, someone to warn. And yet I couldn't turn away. The questions, the mystery, the pull of the unknown, it was too strong. I didn't know it then, but this cabin, this forest, and this journal were going to change everything I thought I knew about reality, about fear, and about what it means to be alone in the wilderness. The forest was patient, yes. It was alive, yes. And it was waiting for something. Whether I was ready or not, I had stumbled into a story that was far from over, a story that was still unfolding with every whisper of wind, every shadow in the trees, and every word written in that leather-bound journal. The next morning I woke to a strange silence. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the forest itself is holding its breath. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the journal's warnings over and over. Every shadow from the night before seemed to linger in my vision, and even the sunlight filtering through the trees couldn't shake the unease. I made coffee, but my hands trembled slightly, and the taste of it felt bitter, almost metallic. As I packed a small bag to explore the area around the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the edge of the porch, the dirt looked disturbed, as if someone, or something, had walked there recently. I knelt down, brushing my fingers over the faint impressions, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the shape was wrong. The prints weren't like anything I had ever seen, not the size, not the spacing, not the way the toes, or whatever they were, pressed into the ground. My stomach knotted. The journal sketches flashed in my mind, the figures surrounding the cabin. It was as if the warning had followed me, leaping from the pages into reality. I forced myself to step off the porch and walk toward the forest, trying to study the prints. The trees pressed closer, their branches forming tangled shapes overhead. Birds were silent. Even the wind felt cautious, whispering through the leaves in low, hesitant waves. I followed the trail a few meters before it vanished into the underbrush. I stood there for a long moment, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Part of me wanted to run back into the safety of the cabin, the other part felt drawn deeper, compelled to uncover what had left the marks. Back inside, I opened the journal again, searching for something, anything that could explain what I had just seen. I found an entry I hadn't noticed before. It was brief but striking. They don't just watch. They move when I am not looking. I hear them in the trees, but when I turn there is nothing. Do not go into the forest at dusk. They will find you. My pulse quickened. I hadn't realized it yet, but the hours I had spent exploring outside had aligned with the time the writer described as dangerous. I shivered, realizing that fear wasn't the only thing they had left in the journal. They had left guidance. Or maybe a warning I might ignore at my own peril. As I tried to focus on something else, I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it. A rustle, not like the wind, not like a small animal. Something deliberate, moving through the underbrush near the cabin. I froze, my eyes scanning the shadows beyond the window. It felt close, almost too close. I whispered to myself, "It's nothing. It's just the forest." But even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe it. Over the next few days, strange things began happening more frequently. Objects in the cabin would move slightly, almost imperceptibly. A chair would be turned, a blanket displaced, small things that could be dismissed as forgetfulness, but the pattern was undeniable. At night, I could hear footsteps circling the cabin, slow and measured, yet impossible to locate. And every time I tried to leave the cabin for a walk, I felt that same pull from the forest, the way it seemed to shift, to watch, to guide me back toward the cabin like it had rules I didn't understand. I started keeping a notebook of my own, jotting down times, sounds, and strange occurrences, hoping to make sense of it all. The journal had warned me about being watched, about the forest remembering, and now it felt like a game of observation. Every sound, every shadow, every shifted object seemed to be part of a pattern I couldn't yet decode. I realized the writer hadn't been paranoid, they had been aware. They had noticed the forest's intelligence, the way it responded to presence, attention, even curiosity. One evening, as twilight fell and the forest turned a dark green-black, I decided to confront my fear. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and walked toward the edge of the trees. The air was thick with tension, almost electric. My own footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. Then I heard it, again, a whisper, this time clearer, like it was carried just beyond my hearing, brushing against my mind. My heart raced, but I forced myself to take a deep breath and call out softly, "Hello?" The forest answered in silence. But the shadows moved. Just at the edge of the trees I glimpsed shapes, figures that seemed human from a distance, but their movement was wrong, jerky, unnatural. I blinked and they were gone. I could feel eyes on me though no one was there. My mind raced back to the journal's repeated warnings. They are patient, they remember, they wait. I wanted to run, but my feet felt heavy, rooted to the spot by a mix of fear and fascination. Inside the cabin I discovered another clue. Tucked behind a loose floorboard was a small bundle of letters, written by someone who had apparently stayed there before the journal's author. They mentioned similar experiences, unexplained noises, shapes in the trees, whispers at night. One letter hinted that the forest had a memory, that it could sense fear, curiosity, and presence. The writer claimed that ignoring it or trying to leave could draw its attention more closely, but the letters were fragmented, never offering a clear solution. It was as if each person who had stayed here had glimpsed the same unsettling truth but had been powerless to understand it fully. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. I began noticing subtle changes in myself, moments of forgetfulness, the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone even when the cabin seemed empty. Shadows lingered in corners longer than they should, sounds echoed too deliberately, and the forest seemed to respond to my every movement. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the isolation was breaking my mind, but deep down I knew the forest was different, alive in ways that made the journal's warnings frighteningly plausible. I started hearing voices again, faint, almost imperceptible. Not words, not sentences, but a rhythm, a tone that felt like it was trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. At first I thought it was the wind, but the pattern was too deliberate. I began talking back, softly, even though I wasn't sure I was speaking to anything. Sometimes the air would shift immediately after, a cold breeze brushing my skin, making me jump. I couldn't tell if it was playful, dangerous, or simply curious, but it was undeniable. The forest was aware and it was responding to me. One night I found myself sitting on the porch, flashlight off, notebook in my lap, staring into the trees. The forest seemed to pulse in the darkness, shadows folding over themselves, stretching toward me and then retreating. I whispered the question that had haunted me since finding the journal. "What do you want?" The wind shifted, a branch snapped loudly, and I felt the forest's presence press closer, like it had heard me. I didn't understand the answer, and maybe there was no answer I could comprehend, but the realization struck me like a hammer. I was not just a visitor here. I was a participant in something far older, far more deliberate than I could imagine. The days began to blur together. Every morning I woke to the same unsettling quiet, the forest pressing in around the cabin, unyielding and watchful. I had started marking my own notes in the notebook I kept beside the journal, documenting every sound, every shadow, every odd impression in the dirt outside. I felt like I was piecing together a puzzle, but the pieces refused to fit neatly. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, rearranging things when I wasn't looking, keeping its own secrets close. One afternoon, I noticed a new set of markings on the trees near the cabin, scratches and carvings I hadn't seen before. They weren't recent, but they weren't old either, worn yet sharp in certain areas. Some resembled symbols. Others looked almost like tally marks. I tried to make sense of them, thinking they might be some kind of warning, left by previous visitors like the journal writer or the author of the letters. But the forest seemed to react to my presence, the leaves rustling in patterns that made my skin prickle. The more I stared, the more I felt like I was trespassing into a language I wasn't meant to read. The journal's entries began to feel more immediate. I could almost hear the writer's voice in my head, their fear bleeding through each word. One entry described a night when they had seen figures moving between the trees, not quite human but not entirely shadow. I remembered the shapes I had glimpsed the other evening and shivered. Another entry mentioned the feeling of being followed even when alone, the sense that every step taken outside the cabin was being monitored, calculated. I realized I was living that same experience now, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. To distract myself, I decided to explore deeper into the forest, hoping distance would give me clarity. I packed water, a small flashlight, and my notebook, trying to rationalize the irrational. As I walked, the forest thickened, the trees leaning close to each other, casting twisted shadows across the narrow trail. Every step felt heavier, as though the soil itself resisted me. Then I heard it, a faint rustle followed by a whisper so soft I almost missed it. It wasn't a word I recognized, but it carried an unmistakable intent. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time, and I felt a presence moving with me. I turned, expecting to see someone, or something, but there was only darkness and the forest stretching endlessly. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, the isolation messing with my mind, but the rational part of me knew better. This was real. And it was patient. The whispers, the shifting shadows, the carvings, they weren't random. They were deliberate, and they were waiting for me to make a mistake. Returning to the cabin, I found another discovery waiting. Hidden behind a loose panel in the wall was a small box filled with what looked like fragments of maps. Some were of the forest itself, drawn with obsessive care, highlighting areas near the cabin, streams, and peculiar clearings. Others were marked with symbols I didn't understand. As I studied them, it struck me that these were left by the previous occupant, another person like the journal writer who had tried to understand the forest's patterns. It became clear that this wasn't a simple cabin, not a simple forest. It was a space with rules I didn't yet know, a web of experiences that previous visitors had tried, and failed, to navigate. That night, the whispers returned, louder now, threaded with an urgency that made my chest tighten. They didn't speak in words I could understand, but their rhythm was almost hypnotic, pulling me toward the window. I stared into the darkness beyond, the trees swaying with a strange precision. I thought I saw movement, figures standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight, watching. I blinked and they were gone. My pulse raced as I realized that each night, the forest wasn't just observing, it was learning, responding, testing. I began noticing other subtle changes. Objects inside the cabin would shift just enough to catch my attention. A chair slightly out of place, a blanket folded differently than I remembered. I started leaving small markers on the floor and walls, trying to map what moved and what stayed, trying to understand if there was a pattern. Each day I cataloged the changes, every sound, every rustle, and yet no explanation made sense. The forest wasn't chaotic, it was intentional. And the journal had hinted at that all along. Then came the dreams. They were vivid, almost too real, blending memories from the journal with my own experiences. In them, I would walk the forest at night, hearing whispers that guided me to certain places, warning me to avoid others. I woke up sweating, my notebook open beside me as though I had been recording in my sleep, but the pages were blank. The line between reality and the forest's influence began to blur. I couldn't tell if the shadows I saw while awake were real or echoes from the dreams. The forest was in my mind now, seeping into every thought, every breath. I also began to sense another presence in the cabin, a subtle, almost human one. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow crossing the room. Other times, I would hear a soft footstep on the creaking floorboards when I knew I was alone. I started leaving small notes around, messages to myself, testing if anyone, or anything, was responding. Sometimes I found them moved in the morning, or smudged as if someone had touched them. The feeling of being observed intensified, and with it the tension in my chest. Despite everything, I couldn't leave. Something in the journal, in the letters, in the forest itself pulled me in deeper. I was desperate to understand, to uncover the pattern, to find the reason why the cabin, the forest, and the journal seemed connected in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. Each discovery led to more questions. Each whisper made me feel like I was on the edge of something immense, something terrifying, something alive. The forest's intelligence became undeniable. It was patient, yes, but also reactive. It remembered patterns, punished mistakes, and seemed to test intruders. Yet there was also a strange allure, a pull I couldn't resist. I realized that whoever had stayed here before, whether through fear, curiosity, or necessity, had left breadcrumbs, clues scattered like pieces of a story I was now living. The cabin was more than a structure. It was a nexus, a point where the forest's awareness intersected with human presence, and I had stepped right into the center. And so the tension grew. Nights became longer, shadows darker, whispers sharper. Every sound, every movement, every rustle in the trees reminded me that the forest wasn't passive. It was awake, deliberate, and watching. I didn't understand its rules yet, but I knew ignoring them was dangerous. Every entry in the journal, every letter, every symbol carved into the trees reinforced one terrifying truth. The forest had memory, awareness, and intention. And I was now part of its story. The forest had changed by the time night fell. It wasn't just quiet anymore, it felt expectant. The air hung heavy, thick with a smell I couldn't identify, earthy and metallic all at once. I had spent the day poring over the journal, the letters, and the maps, trying to understand the patterns, to prepare myself for whatever the forest might throw at me. But the more I studied, the less sense it made. Every symbol, every mark on the maps, every warning felt like a fragment of a puzzle I would never fully solve. And yet I couldn't turn away. I felt like the forest was daring me to step further, testing how much I could endure. As twilight deepened, I heard it again, whispers closer this time, like someone, or something, was moving through the trees, pacing me, circling the cabin. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I gripped the flashlight tighter, though I barely dared to shine it outside. Shadows moved just at the edge of the light, forming shapes that seemed impossible, figures that vanished the moment I blinked. I remembered the journal's repeated warnings. They are patient, they remember, they wait. And suddenly I understood the weight of those words. The forest had been watching me since I arrived. Every step, every glance, every sound I made had been recorded, acknowledged, and noted. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was overreacting, that the shadows were tricks of my own imagination. But the proof was undeniable. Objects inside the cabin had shifted again. The chair I had pulled closer to the fire earlier in the evening was back near the wall. My notebook lay open on the floor, pages flipped to a section I hadn't been working on. And the whispering, it wasn't outside anymore. It seemed to seep through the walls, threading itself through the air of the cabin, circling me, mocking me, testing me. I could feel it then, a presence I could not name. Not human, not animal, something older, more aware, more deliberate. It was patient, silent, and yet it made every nerve in my body tense with anticipation. I remembered one of the journal entries: "They do not chase. They do not strike. They wait for you to step wrong. And when you do, it is too late." The words repeated themselves in my mind, a drumbeat of warning. I could almost feel eyes on me from every shadow, every tree, every corner of the cabin. I was trapped in a living, breathing web. I knew I had to confront it, at least in some way. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, the ground cold beneath my feet. The forest stretched out around me, black and infinite. The whispering had stopped for a moment, replaced by a tense, oppressive silence. I walked carefully toward the trees, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness, though I knew it wouldn't reach far. Shapes moved just beyond the light, figures fleeting and impossible to track. Every step I took, the shadows seemed to reposition, as if they were aware of my movements. I came across a clearing I hadn't noticed before. The moonlight fell in shards through the canopy, illuminating faint carvings on the trees, symbols I had seen in the journal and on the maps. I froze, realizing that I had walked into a place that had been marked intentionally. My heart pounded. The forest had led me here. Or perhaps it had waited for me to find it. I could almost feel its pulse, the deliberate rhythm of the unseen presence that surrounded me. I wasn't just in the forest anymore, I was inside its consciousness, its memory, its game. Suddenly the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They surrounded me, coming from all directions, overlapping, impossible to pinpoint. I spun around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, but the forest offered no answers. The trees swayed unnaturally, shadows stretching and collapsing as though alive. My skin prickled with a sensation I couldn't name. The forest was aware, alive, and somehow reacting to me, to my fear, to my every heartbeat. I stumbled back toward the cabin, my mind racing, every instinct screaming that I should hide, that I should leave, that I should do anything but stand there. But the forest seemed to close in, the edges of the clearing dissolving into darkness, twisting, reshaping itself as though it had no fixed boundaries. The journal's warnings echoed in my mind: do not go into the forest at dusk. They will find you. They know everything. I could feel the truth in those words now more than ever. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, but the relief was fleeting. The whispers penetrated the walls, and the shadows moved along them, responding to the light, to the air, to me. I could no longer distinguish between sound and thought, between perception and reality. Every object, every shadow, every corner of the cabin seemed charged with intent. I realized that the forest wasn't just observing me, it was communicating in a language I could barely grasp, teasing me, testing me, showing me how small and vulnerable I really was. I tried to steady my breath and my thoughts. The journal lay open beside me, its pages full of clues and warnings I hadn't fully absorbed. I reread an entry I had skipped before: when you think it is safe, it is not. They remember every sound, every movement, every hesitation. Trust nothing. Do not look directly. Do not draw attention. Do not step wrong. The words chilled me. The forest had a memory, and it knew me now. It had catalogued my fear, my curiosity, my missteps. And tonight it seemed to be preparing for something more. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and I could hear the whispering shift, almost impatiently, circling closer now. My heart raced, every muscle tense. The shadows lengthened and moved with an unnatural rhythm, stretching toward the cabin and then retracting, testing the barriers between inside and outside. I realized with a sinking feeling that the forest wasn't just outside anymore, it was in the cabin with me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt distorted, stretched by tension, compressed by fear. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't leave. I could only watch, listen, and wait. Every noise, every movement, every whisper felt like a signal, a warning, a promise. I knew that whatever the forest wanted from me, it was patient. It had been watching long before I arrived, and it would continue to watch. It had led me here, guided me to this moment, and now it was only a matter of time before the next stage began. And so I waited, heart hammering, senses on edge, trapped in a cabin that had become a nexus between human curiosity and something far older, far more deliberate, and far more dangerous than I could have imagined. Every shadow, every whisper, every rustle of leaves reminded me that the forest was alive, aware, and unstoppable. And as the night deepened, I realized one terrifying truth: the climax of this story was coming. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the air shifted, in the rhythm of the whispers that surrounded me. I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew I was about to face the forest in its purest, most terrifying state, and there was no turning back now. The night had never felt heavier. The whispers had grown into a constant hum around the cabin, vibrating through the walls and under the floorboards. I could no longer tell if they were outside or inside, or if the air itself carried them. Every shadow seemed to twitch, pulse, and stretch toward me. I clutched the flashlight and the journal tightly, the pages worn from constant reading, searching for guidance. I knew that whatever was coming was close, and that the forest had been waiting for this very moment. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold, dense air. The clearing I had discovered days ago glowed faintly under the moonlight, and the carvings on the trees seemed to shift slightly in the dim light, almost like they were moving when I wasn't looking. My heart pounded as I realized the truth I had been avoiding. The forest wasn't just alive, it was intelligent. Every sound, every motion, every step I had taken was noted, remembered, catalogued. And now it wanted me to understand it. The shadows coalesced slowly at the edges of the clearing, forming humanoid shapes that moved with an unnatural fluidity. They didn't speak, but the whispers became coherent, almost like a chorus of voices echoing in my mind. I felt them probing, testing, judging. I remembered the journal's warnings: do not step wrong. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, trying to remain calm, trying to communicate in the only way I could, by showing no fear. Suddenly the forest surged around me. Shadows lunged from the trees, twisting in shapes I couldn't comprehend, yet I could feel their presence pressing in on all sides. I dropped to my knees, heart racing, praying that I had done enough to respect the forest rules, to follow the unspoken path. And then I heard it, a whisper distinctly separate from the rest, almost human. "You see us." I froze. Those words carried recognition, approval, and a terrible weight. Slowly the shapes began to retract, flowing back into the darkness of the trees. The forest seemed to sigh, a deep, resonant exhalation that left the air heavy and still. I looked around, trembling, and for the first time the forest felt quiet. Observant but quiet. The whispers had faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves, the faint wind, and my own rapid breathing. Inside the cabin, I found a final entry in the journal I hadn't noticed before. It was brief, almost like a note left as a key. "They are not evil. They are guardians. They test, they observe, they remember. Fear feeds them, respect binds them. You survived because you saw. You survived because you did not run." I sank to the floor, my hands shaking, the weight of understanding pressing down on me. The forest's patience, its intelligence, its patterns, it wasn't a force meant to harm indiscriminately. It was a measure of respect, a balance between curiosity and caution, survival and acknowledgement. For the first time in days I slept. The cabin was silent, the forest calm, and my mind quiet. But the peace was fragile, and I knew the forest was still watching. I stepped outside the next morning, examining the ground, the trees, the carvings. Everything seemed unchanged, yet I could feel the subtle rhythm of the forest, alive beneath the surface, patient, waiting. I had survived, but I was not free. The rules remained, the guardians remained, and the balance had not shifted. I was only a visitor who had been allowed to see, to learn, to endure. As I packed my things to leave, a strange thought struck me. I glanced down at the dirt near the cabin, and there, faint in the soil, were footprints, small, human, but not mine. They led from the edge of the forest, circling the cabin and stopping just short of the porch. My stomach twisted. The forest hadn't just tested me. It had prepared someone else. Or perhaps it had always been waiting for another. I froze as I realized the final twist, the truth that the journal and letters had hinted at but never fully revealed. The forest's game wasn't over. It wasn't personal, it was perpetual. Each visitor, each curious soul, each wanderer drawn to the cabin became part of the pattern. The forest remembered, observed, and waited for the next chapter. And now, as I stepped into my car, I understood that I wasn't escaping entirely. The forest had marked me. Its memory of me, my fear, my respect, would linger long after I left. And one day it might call again. I took a deep breath, started the engine, and glanced back at the cabin. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, shadows stretching like fingers. The journal sat in the passenger seat beside me, a reminder of what I had learned, and what I had survived. But the final chilling thought stayed with me: the forest doesn't forgive curiosity. It doesn't forget those who enter its depths. And while I had survived this encounter, I would carry its presence with me forever. As the cabin disappeared behind me, swallowed by the dense forest, I felt eyes on my back, unblinking, patient, and unyielding. The whispers returned faintly on the wind, almost as if they were laughing, or perhaps just acknowledging that the story wasn't finished. I had endured, but the forest's memory endured too, and its patience meant that someday, somehow, it might call me, or someone else, back into its depths. The drive away from the forest was slow. Every mile I put between myself and the cabin, I felt the weight of the experience settle deeper into my chest. The journal lay on the passenger seat, its pages now full of notes and observations I had added during my stay. I glanced down at it, wondering how much I had truly understood and how much the forest had allowed me to see. The trees in the rearview mirror grew smaller with every turn, but the sense of being observed never entirely faded. I thought back to the letters I had found behind the floorboard. They had belonged to someone who had stayed in the cabin before the journal's author, someone who had chronicled experiences eerily similar to mine. Each letter had hinted at a cycle, a pattern that repeated itself over time. The same whispers, the same figures, the same feeling of being watched. At first, I had dismissed them as superstition or paranoia, but now I realized they were records of survival. Each visitor had faced the forest tests differently, leaving breadcrumbs for the next. The letters, combined with the journal, had been a guide, a warning that the forest measured respect as much as curiosity. I thought about the strange carvings, the symbols etched into the trees. They had felt like random patterns at first, but now I understood their purpose. They weren't threats or directions. They were markers, indicators of what the forest had observed, of what had been endured. They were a language, one that could only be interpreted through presence, observation, and patience. I had been taught it without ever realizing it, guided by the echoes of those who had come before. My mind wandered to the moments I had stood in the clearing at night, surrounded by shadows that seemed impossible to track, whispering in a chorus I could barely understand. The fear I had felt wasn't random, it had been a measure, a gauge of my awareness, my respect for the space, and my willingness to engage with it without harming it or myself. The forest had tested me not to punish but to teach. And somehow I had survived. Somehow I had earned its acknowledgement. Even now, hours later, I could feel the subtle imprint of the forest in my mind. It had left traces in my memory, a rhythm I couldn't shake, a way of thinking about the natural world that felt alive, deliberate, and intelligent. The whispers, the movements, the presence, all of it had been part of a lesson about observation, patience, and humility. I realized that survival wasn't just about evading fear, it was about understanding, respecting, and accepting the unknown. The journal had been my guide, but it had also been a warning. Whoever had written it had understood what the forest demanded, and through their words, I had learned that the forest doesn't act out of malice, it acts out of balance. Fear and disrespect could provoke it. Curiosity paired with caution could earn its acknowledgement. The forest was not my enemy, it was a force of nature, patient and eternal, and my time there had taught me how delicate the line between awareness and danger could be. As I drove, I considered the footprints I had seen near the cabin before leaving. Small, human, deliberate. The forest's memory was long. It remembered those who entered, and it kept track of those who survived. I knew that my encounter was just one in a long series of interactions, one chapter in an ongoing story that had existed long before I arrived and would continue long after I left. The forest's guardians were patient. They observed, they tested, and they remembered. And I too would carry that memory now, marked by what I had experienced. I stopped the car at a small clearing by the roadside, the light of dawn just beginning to filter through the trees. I stepped out, stretching my legs, and looked back toward where the forest lay. From here it seemed calm, quiet, even inviting, but I knew better. The forest's awareness had not diminished, it simply waited, silent and eternal. I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from fear but from respect. The forest had taught me something vital, that the world is far larger and more deliberate than we often realize, and that survival depends on more than skill or courage. It depends on understanding and reverence for the forces beyond our comprehension. I thought about the journal one last time. I would leave it for the next visitor just as it had been left for me. The knowledge within it was valuable, yes, but it was also a responsibility. The forest had provided lessons, and now it was my turn to pass on what I had learned, to guide someone else who might one day stumble into its depths. But as I set it carefully in the back seat, I couldn't help but glance at the shadows around me. A sense of being observed lingered, faint but unmistakable. The forest remembered, and I was part of that memory now. The drive back toward civilization was quiet, but my mind was alive with reflections. I thought about the patterns, the letters, the journal, and the forest itself. Each piece of the story, each encounter, had been a test and a revelation. Fear and curiosity had intertwined, but survival had come from attentiveness and respect. I realized that the experience had changed me, not just in memory but in perspective. I now saw the world as layered with consciousness and unseen patterns, filled with spaces that demanded care and attention. As the town came into view, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. Relief at leaving the isolation, the intensity, the relentless awareness of the forest. Unease because I knew its influence would not simply vanish. The memory of the shadows, the whispers, and the subtle, deliberate presence of the forest would remain with me. I could no longer approach nature the same way I had before. It had taught me that observation matters, that even in silence, there is knowledge and intention. Once home, I unpacked the journal and placed it on a shelf where I could study it from time to time. Its pages were worn, filled with warnings, observations, and guidance. I had added my own notes, my own experiences, creating a record that might one day serve the next person who found it. The forest had its own rules, its own consciousness, but through the journal, a thread connected me to the past and to the future. I had survived because I had listened, because I had observed, and because I had respected the forest's hidden order.